Thank you, Regina, and thanks, Leo, for the invitation. It's great to be here. So I'm going to start out by pushing back a little bit on the zombie reforms idea because I think it suggests that that the research has to be just up or down, when in fact I would argue that it might have more nuanced implications for policy. So these two cases, online charter schools and vouchers, are certainly superficially similar in that, as you heard from Regina, both of them have had recent research that showed negative impacts on test scores. But I think that superficial consistency is a little misleading because, in fact, the research on the two different reforms is quite different from each other. And I think that they suggest that the research suggests different implications for policy in ways that go beyond just thumbs up versus thumbs down. In the case of online charters, there's not a whole lot of research. They're a relatively new educational phenomenon. But the research that exists on them, as far as I can tell, is unequivocally negative. And more to the point, we have a little bit of information on how they operate that suggests why they're getting, in general, very negative results. In the case of vouchers, there's lots more research. They've existed for a long time, and people have been doing research on them for several decades. And they've been doing research on a variety of different dimensions beyond test scores. And Regina alluded to a few of those issues. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. But the different findings, I think, could lead to different policy conclusions. And also, though, I'd argue that paradoxically, even though there's a lot more research on vouchers, there's nevertheless a lot more that we still need to know to help to inform policy. So first with online charters, I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs that came from a report that we at Mathematica did a few years ago called Inside Online Charter Schools, and there's a synopsis of that in the packet of materials you got. This was a project that we did in collaboration with Mackie and her team at Credo. And I'll let Mackie tell you about the achievement impacts. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they were doing, which makes it, I think, not surprising that the achievement impacts that Mackie and her team found were so overwhelmingly negative. First thing you can look at is students per full-time teacher. Turns out that online charters are staffed at much lower levels than conventional schools. Brick and mortar charter schools had a student-teacher ratio of about 20-1, conventional public schools about 17-1, online charters 30-1. Not necessarily a recipe for great results. And you see that even more powerfully in this next chart, which tells you how much live interaction students typically get with an online charter teacher in a typical week. These are in 4th grade, 7th grade, and high school. These are the reports of the principals of the online charter schools. They told us, in essence, that kids in online charter schools receive less live interaction time with a teacher in a week than kids in conventional schools do in a day. Now, a lot of the kids who enroll in online charter schools, probably especially at the high school level, are kids who have had trouble in conventional schools, have become disengaged. So it hardly seems like a recipe for success to serve a population of disengaged kids and only engage them for a few hours every week when you have no ability to make sure they're in their seats, so to speak. So I think we've got some not only pretty strong negative findings about their effects, but also pretty clear indications of why that might happen, and how it isn't a good fit for at least many of the students they are serving, if not all of them. Turning to vouchers, here I'm going to show you a couple of charts that are not my own. I borrowed these from other researchers. This first one comes from a Brookings report of Donarski and Nichols from a couple of years ago. This is just showing the range of test score impacts that have been seen in a variety of different voucher studies. And it shows, if you look at the top part of the graph, it shows those negative impacts that people have talked about a good bit in recent years. But it also shows that typical results in quite a few studies before that hadn't been nearly as negative. So it's not at all unequivocally negative in terms of the test scores in the way that the online charter literature is. Then there's the fact that a lot of voucher studies have now started to look at other outcomes, and on some of those other outcomes, the impacts, at least in some of the studies, are actually positive. Now, not universally so. This graph comes from an Urban Institute report from just a couple of months ago that showed impacts on college enrollment for students participating in the voucher program that's funded by tax credits in the state of Florida. And here, if these effects are real, they're pretty big and pretty positive. You know, it's showing a 10 percentage point increase in college participation for students in the program. Now, it's not a randomized trial. It's possible that that's an overestimate. It's also worth noting that the rest of this report, which I think is also copied in your folder, shows other programs that did not produce positive results. But the general point I want to make here is that the research in general is more mixed, and there have been instances showing positive results on outcomes that go beyond just things like parental satisfaction. So the big question is, what should policymakers do with this evidence? And I think that the two cases, online charters and vouchers, are useful for illustrating different ways that research can inform policy. And they're also useful for demonstrating the limits of what research can do in informing policy. In the case of online charters, I'd suggest that what we know here provides a pretty strong case that authorizers and regulators ought to be paying closer attention to them. They ought to be making sure that they are not doing this on the cheap, so to speak, that they are providing services with a reasonable level of intensity so that kids are actually being served, and that maybe they ought to be paying more attention to figuring out which kids might benefit. So it's at least conceivable that there's some populations of kids, maybe they live in distant rural areas, maybe they are kids who are just not feel that they're not well suited socially to a conventional school. Maybe they're kids who are sufficiently self-motivated to do a lot of their work on their own. Perhaps there's an opportunity for online schooling to serve those kids well. But that's the kind of thing that one would hope that authorizers and regulators would be paying attention to in the school's applications and in the way they operate once they open. In the case of vouchers, as I said, the evidence is pretty mixed. It really does depend on the outcomes you look at. And it's worth acknowledging that different stakeholders might value different outcomes. So one reason that, of course, you might still see advocates proposing this, even if they were to admit that there isn't good evidence of positive test score effects, if they care more about just giving parents, low-income parents, choices, if they think that the long-term attainment effects in Florida are likely to generalize, there are reasons they might favor them. I'd also say that there are a lot of these outcomes that need a lot more attention in the case of vouchers. Here, there was an interesting debate in Massachusetts a couple of years ago when there was a ballot initiative. It wasn't about vouchers, it was about charters and whether the state would lift the cap on charter schools. And some of my colleagues in the research community pointed to the fact that in Boston in particular, charter schools have shown pretty large and consistent positive outcomes on test scores. And they viewed that as the sort of thing that ought to justify lifting the charter cap. But in fact, the debate in Massachusetts was not really about whether those existing schools were effective for their kids. It was about how raising the charter cap would affect the conventional public schools, which is an entirely appropriate question that just can't be addressed by research on the effects on the participating kids, right? It's a different research question. Now, it's harder to study, but it can be done, and there's research on that issue too. We need a lot more of it. I bring that up though just to make the point that a lot of the debate on vouchers is similar in that there are reasonable questions about whether they could have either negative or positive effects on the conventional public schools and the kids who are served there. So I think that there is some guidance in all of this for policymakers, but I think that also as researchers, we also have to recognize that we need to have some humility in understanding how much our findings can inform the policy debate. Thanks.